مرحبا بكم مشاهدينا في حوارات السياق. يحاول المفاوضون في فيينا إيجاد طريقة لإحياء الاتفاق النووي مع إيران، والذي وافقت بموجبه الولايات المتحدة وبريطانيا وألمانيا وفرنسا وروسيا والصين على رفع العقوبات المفروضة على طهران في مقابل فرض قيود صارمة على برنامجها النووي، والذي بات يقترب حاليا أكثر من أي وقت مضى من مرحلة تخصيب اليورانيوم الذي يستخدم في صنع الأسلحة النووية. عموما للمزيد من المتابعة حول هذا الملف ينضم إلينا تشاك فرايليخ، نائب مستشار الأمن القومي السابق في إسرائيل والخبير في شؤون الشرق الأوسط. مرحبا تشاك.
Hi, thanks for having me.
هل ما زال الاتفاق النووي هو الحل الأمثل للمعضلة النووية الإيرانية؟
Well, I think diplomacy is always preferable. And since I don't think we have any really good options for dealing with the Iranian issue, of the bad options available, it's the least bad, or it's the best of the bad. I don't think it can be exactly the same deal because a lot has happened since then. The Iranian program has advanced considerably. For all practical purposes, they've broken out of it, and they are, in essence, a threshold nuclear state today. So a new deal will have to account for some of the changes to roll them back. But the fundamental principles, I think, still hold.
تحدثت عن الخيارات السيئة. هل توجيه إسرائيل ضربة لإيران خيار سيء؟ وهل بات الأمر قريباً؟
Well, first of all, I think it's a bad option in the sense that I would hope that it would only happen after every other possible option has been exhausted. If it happened before then, and I don't think it will, then it would be even worse. But the kind of situation that I'm talking about, I don't think that Israel would act militarily except as a last resort. And at that point, as a last resort, and in the worst case scenario, I think Israel will have to do it. But the amount of time that will be gained is quite limited, and there will be a heavy price to pay for it.
طيب، في حال ضربت إسرائيل إيران ماذا سيحدث؟
Well, the Iranians will respond. I think that's self-evident. They will have little choice but to respond. The question is, do they decide to limit their response just to Israel, which would seem to me to be the logical move on their part? Do they maybe expand it a bit to some of the other regional actors, to the Saudis, to the UAE? Or do they really decide to expand and turn this into a regional conflagration? And that, of course, is what the US and the international community are concerned about. I would imagine that they will do something, some limited acts against some of the other regional actors, and maybe something symbolic or maybe a little bit more than symbolic against the US. But I don't think they really want to get into a significant conflict with the United States. That's a losing proposition from their point of view. It seems to me that just through a process of elimination, just by logic, they would want to focus their response overwhelmingly on Israel. And they built up a dramatic capability in the form of Hezbollah and some of their own direct capabilities, but mostly through Hezbollah, to hit Israel in a way that it's never been hit in its history.
العديد من الخبراء بما في ذلك مسؤولون إسرائيليون استبعدوا إمكانية قدرة إسرائيل على تدمير البرنامج النووي الإيراني. ما رأيك؟
The program passed the point where it could be destroyed in the sense of being completely destroyed, because let's say that you launched a 100% successful attack and destroyed every one of the nuclear facilities. At this point, the Iranians have the technological know-how and they can reconstitute it. It's just a question of rebuilding some of the physical facilities. How long would that take? I don't know, 2 years, 3 years, certainly not more than that. Probably not a lot less than 2. But then Israel has to ask itself, can it even achieve that objective? And if so, is it worth it? even the United States today, for the same reason, I mean, a global superpower, and military colossus, the US obviously has greater capabilities and can cause more damage at a lower cost to itself than Israel can. But for the same reason, the Iranians have the know-how. Even the US can't destroy it anymore. So the question is what degree of limited damage you can achieve, or what limited time gain you can achieve. And then how do you use that time to hopefully see to it that Iran does not reconstitute, whether it's under the threat of further action, whether it's under diplomatic and economic sanctions, whatever.
هناك من يرى أنه في حال دخول تل أبيب في حرب مع طهران ستشتعل المنطقة كلها. ما رأيك؟
That's basically what I was addressing before, in the sense that I don't think the Iranians want to see a regional conflagration. I don't see how that serves their purposes. They will have to respond against Israel, that's for sure. They have to from their perspective. I think that they will want to do something to make it look good to their own domestic opinion and for reasons of their overall strategy to lash back a little bit against the United States and maybe against some of the other regional players, the Saudis, UAE, maybe some other countries. But to go beyond a really limited move, which would lead to a major confrontation with the United States. The Iranians may be extremists, but they are very, very rational, carefully calculating players. And to take on the United States is, of course, a no-win situation for them. So I don't think they want to do that. I don't think they want a major escalation with the other Arab actors in the region, because that brings the US in also. And when it comes to Israel, they have certainly from their own domestic public opinion, some regional opinion and some international opinion, they have greater justification, legitimization for striking out at Israel. And that's where they have their greatest capability. So it seems to me that would be where they would focus the attack.
إسرائيل ودول الخليج ليست على طاولة المفاوضات في فيينا. هل سيعاد سيناريو 2015؟
Well, I mean, that's the way it is. This is a P6-led negotiation, the major global powers. We the other actors, and in some ways we're the ones who are most affected by this, we do have the ability to convey our positions to the different actors, and I think all of the players in the region have been quite active in doing so. So, I mean, it's always like this. The superpowers lead and everyone else tries to influence them. I think the coordination between the sides is better this time. Certainly the US-Israeli dialogue is better now than it was when Mr. Netanyahu was in office. But the possibility of secret negotiations, even a backdoor channel, that's not unprecedented. That happens in negotiations, and we have to be prepared for that to happen this time as well.
لماذا باعتقادك اختارت دول الخليج الحديث مباشرة مع إيران في الفترة الأخيرة؟
Well, in terms of Israel, I think the answer is no. I think Iran has a fundamental position towards Israel, which is that the only solution is Israel's destruction. It's not as if they have some specific demand that if Israel would accede to, then things could be okay. So, for example, there's a fundamental difference in their attitude towards the United States, the great Satan, and their attitudes towards Israel, the little Satan, in the sense that if the US corrected its behavior, saw the light, and acted in ways that the Iranians wanted, Iran could accept the United States. They'd never love it, but they could accept it. That's not the case when it comes to Israel. There is nothing that Israel could do other than agreeing to self-destruct that I think would change Iran's policies towards it. So I don't think there's a role for a middleman with Israel, possibly a helping role with the US and the other part of the P6. But I think that the parties have the ability to talk here. So I don't know if that's quite so critical. My understanding of what is happening is that the real reason that we see the Saudis and the UAE talking to Iran today is a lack of confidence that they truly have American backing, that the American commitment to their security may not be quite as strong as it was in the past. And people are concerned, and so they're looking for other ways to address the issue, seeing if there's any way that they can lower the level of tensions directly with Iran.
طيب، الأحداث في سوريا، القصف الإسرائيلي الأخير هناك، هل له أي علاقة بمحادثات فيينا كإحدى أوراق الضغط؟
I don't think there's any direct relationship. You can say that there's an indirect attempt to send a message to Iran that Israel could attack it, and it is certainly trying to prevent Iran from setting up a military capability of its own in Syrian territory, supplying Hezbollah through Syrian territory. I don't think there's a direct link.
العرب وإسرائيل، ما احتمالية التعاون في مجال مواجهة التهديدات المشتركة؟ هل نحن أقرب إلى ذلك من أي وقت مضى؟
Well, an alliance is a strong word, but I think if you look at what happened with the Abraham Accords, the primary motivating factor behind that was the common fear of Iran. And that led to what I believe is a simply historic, a dramatic change in the history of the region, in the sense that we had 4 Arab countries making peace with Israel, doing so despite the fact that the previous position had made that contingent on progress on the Palestinian front, and unfortunately that didn't happen. A change where I think maybe it's also a generational change on the part of these countries, but it's a new willingness to live alongside Israel despite some fundamental differences, because there are common interests as well. There's Iran, I already said. There's an interest in trade, economic ties, Israel's high-tech capabilities. So I think those were the primary motivating factors behind this. And we also see far deeper cooperation between Israel and Egypt and Israel and Jordan than we saw in previous years, not directly related to Iran, but affected by this overall change in Israel's position in the region.
شكرا تشاك فرايليخ، نائب مستشار الأمن القومي السابق في إسرائيل، للمشاركة معنا في حوارات السياق. مشاهدينا، شكرا على طيب المتابعة، إلى الملتقى.